Earlier, I spoke to Richard Hermer KC, barrister at Matrix Chambers, who specialises in international law, who, along with 7 other eminent Jewish lawyers, wrote an open letter calling on Israel to remember its, quote, international law obligations. Now, the letter starts with the group saying that there are 3 key points that they want to underline, and at this moment, I think it's important to bring you that interview. I asked Richard to explain what these 3 key points were for the listeners.
So we make 3, as you say, we make 3 points, and we start chronologically. And we start with explaining that what Hamas perpetrated in Israel were grave breaches of international law. I mean, not only were they morally obviously repugnant, so are they legally absolutely prohibited. They're grave war crimes, they're crimes against humanity, and that needs to be stated very clearly. And flowing from that was our second point, which was that Israel, in light of those attacks, plainly has a right to self-defense, and indeed an obligation to protect its citizens, including those who are being held outrageously as hostages in Gaza. But the third point flowing from that was that international law not only governs what Hamas did in Israel, it also very much governs what Israel is currently doing in Gaza. And there are a system of laws, not only international human rights laws, but most importantly, as we stand today, the laws of war, which we call international humanitarian law, that govern what Israel is doing. And those are the 3 points that we wanted to make in that letter.
Richard, broadly, can you outline the specific laws you're talking about and the legal concepts that you are urging Israel to stay within?
Yes, of course. Can I just start, though, by saying with all these laws, international humanitarian law, the laws of war, international human rights law, what underpins them all is a belief in the importance of human dignity. And that's human dignity irrespective of whom the actions are addressed at. Human dignity, equality before the law, these underpin international law every bit as much as they do our domestic laws. So the laws of war that govern Israel's actions in Gaza apply uniformly, irrespective of the levels of atrocities that Hamas committed in Israel. And they require Israel to respect and distinguish between, protect civilian life insofar as is possible, to distinguish in their actions between civilians and combatants, and to take all reasonable measures to spare civilian life. And those are the underpinnings, the legal objective standards, which apply to Israel every second of the day in respect of their military actions within Gaza.
Does this concept of human dignity essentially trump a country's right to self-defense, as Israel argues it?
It doesn't trump a right to self-defense. It governs the means by which the country can act in self-defense. So Israel faced these atrocities on its soil. Its citizens were abducted and taken to Gaza. It's facing rocket attacks. It has, in international law, a right to self-defense. What international humanitarian law does is it governs the means in which you can act in self-defense. It recognizes that in self-defense, countries can use military force, but it insists that basic standards are maintained, and at the core of which is protecting civilians and the sanctity of human life and the essence of human dignity.
Richard, I have interviewed spokespeople for both the Israeli Defense Force and the Israeli government, and they are absolutely adamant that Israel is operating within international law. For example, they say prior to bombings, there are air raid warnings. They say that they have asked 1.1 million Gazans to flee from northern Gaza to southern Gaza prior to their ground incursions.
Yeah, can I just respond to that, if I may, and to identify 2 particular areas of really very, very significant concern. The first is to the basis of the siege that is currently being imposed upon the people of Gaza, and the second is the nature of the bombardment that Gaza is currently sustaining. And in respect of the siege, it's important to understand the context here. Gaza is called the Gaza Strip, literally for a reason. It is a small, very small strip of land with over 2 million people crowded into it, nearly half of whom are children. And that's a very important context for understanding how international law applies here. In respect of the siege, sieges have been used and identified as part of international law for a long time. Sieges per se of military personnel might not be contrary to international law, but it is almost impossible to conceive of how a siege that deprives a civilian population, as I say, almost half of whom are children, of the basic necessities of life, of food, of water, of electricity. It is very difficult to conceive how that could be said to be in compliance with international law. And equally, although, as I said, Israel has a clear right of self-defense, looking at an order that requires 1 million people in an already incredibly confined space to move out of their homes into the south, and then nevertheless to have this bombardment, both in north and south, causing such enormous devastation. Again, it is very difficult to conceive how that could be said to comply with international law.
The IDF's Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner last week said to me repeatedly that Israel has no obligation to supply food, water and fuel to Gaza.
Yes, well, I'm afraid I profoundly disagree. Israel has had now for a very long time effective control of the borders of Gaza, who are reliant upon the need to have electricity coming in, having water coming in, having food coming in order to sustain life for 2 million people. And the cutting of that off, that is producing the level of suffering that we are seeing, is, I'm afraid, very, very difficult to reconcile with obligations in international law. And that's a deliberate understatement from me.
Israeli spokespeople are saying that their hands are tied, and that their hands are tied, for example, because they claim that Hamas has tunnels under, for example, the Al-Shifa hospital, Gaza's biggest hospital, from which they are organising operations. And they say that that is an indication that Hamas is using civilians as cover. And that is where the real breach of international law lies.
Well, it is absolutely, and let's be clear, Hamas using civilian infrastructure as cover is undoubtedly a breach of international law. I mean, it's an outrageous breach of international law for Hamas to act in that way. Another outrageous breach of international law by Hamas. But it does not absolve, by the same token, the Israeli army from the obligations to comply with the international law. And it, of course, will make it far more difficult a task for Israeli commanders to achieve their objectives. But it does not give them a green card to destroy hospitals in which civilians are sheltering and being treated.
I spoke to Yossi Benin, a very well-known politician in Israel, someone who's considered on the left. And I asked him about the issue of proportionality. And he said, it's almost impossible to judge what proportionality is in this case because of the scale of the heinous act carried out by Hamas, which saw the slaughter of more Jews at any one time since the Second World War. Is he right?
I think proportionality is an essential governing principle for any commander either directing an overall operation or particular operations or considering particular targets. And that's a feature that should be drilled into every soldier and every commander. Stepping back, looking more through a wider lens at what's been going on over the last days and few weeks, and looking at the degree of destruction in Gaza, the displacement of so many people, the sheer number of civilian deaths, including this kind of dreadful number of children. It's very hard to see that this is proportionate. And you don't judge, and this is, I think, a really important point, you don't judge proportionality by a direct reference to the outrageous atrocities that Hamas committed in Israel. That's not the lodestar of proportionality here. So I have enormous respect for Yossi Belin, who's played as you say, he's on the left in Israel. He's played a significant role in the peace movement. But on this one, I'm afraid I disagree with him.
Is the concept for proportionality codified?
Well, there's nothing that's in international law that kind of sets out, that gives you a table that says, if this side's done that, or you can do this, or if there are a certain number of fighters in one building, you're allowed to take the following actions. There's nothing that's as straightforward as that. So, but the concept of proportionality, the concept of the essential need to distinguish between civilians and combatants, that is baked into the very heart of international humanitarian law, the laws of war.
Richard, what struck me reading the open letter that 8 of you signed was that you begin, your opening words are, "We write as Jews." And the second paragraph begins, "We also write in our capacity as lawyers," and I should say, as very eminent human rights lawyers, including Lord Neuberger, former president of the UK Supreme Court, yourself, Professor Sandra Friedman of University of Oxford, and also Danny Friedman, KC, unrelated, I should say. Why is it important for you to upfront state your Jewishness?
That's a really complex question, and each of us may have done it for different reasons. I mean, I should say, I've spent my life in international human rights work and human rights work here, and I do that as a human rights lawyer, not as a Jewish lawyer. But I think we all felt that there are times in which our values as lawyers and in which our values as Jews come together. And that sometimes, although it's much more comfortable not to say something, that we had an obligation both as lawyers and Jews to stand up and say what we feel. And there are two things flowing from that, Sangita, that I think certainly I can say, speaking for myself. I mean, the first is that as a Jewish person, I was drawn to law and the rule of law and the importance of protection of human rights because of my own and my family's experience, and not least knowing that the great human rights protections and the laws of war were in very large part codified and brought to the fore because of the experiences of the Holocaust. And that is ingrained in the DNA of certainly of my generation. And so promoting those in these incredibly difficult and sensitive times, I think, was important to us all. And the other important thing is I think we recognized then, and it's even more the case 2 weeks on, that this is a debate that suffers from people finding themselves in silos, some sort of zero-sum game, that you can only be for one side or for the other, that you can only recognize the suffering of one side and not the other. And that is a really dangerous and really unhelpful path. And what we wanted to say was, look, both law and morality give you a way through here to understand the conflict, to govern it. And underpinning it all, I kind of end with where I started, is the great importance of respecting human life, human dignity, whoever is suffering, whoever that individual is. And that helps us today when we're trying to understand the conflict. And I think it will also help us as we look forward to what could only be a future that will only be sorted not by law. Law helps us understand now, and it can prosecute and it can bring accountability. But it's not the answer here. The answer is a political one. And likewise, that political solution will only work if it is one that is based upon empathy for all sides, respecting human dignity, and the notion of equality.
That was Richard Hermer KC, barrister at Matrix Chambers, who specialises in international law, who, along with 7 other eminent Jewish lawyers, including Lord Neuberger, who, of course, was the former president of the Supreme Court in the UK, condemning Hamas's war crimes and also calling on Israel to remember its international law obligations.